Tonight, I am going to continue talking about the book Essential Practice by Thrangu Rinpoche, and I will be talking about Chapter 3 and Chapter 4 of the Intermediate Treatise by Kamala Shila. This is the second treatise, which is titled The Intermediate Treatise on the Stages of Meditation in the Middle Way School. Tonight I'll be talking about Chapter 3, which is the causes of awakening, and Chapter 4, which is about the selflessness of people. So I am going to start here with Chapter 3, the causes of insight. The first thing I want to talk about is the way the teacher is looked at in the three yanas, the three paths. This is not in the book, but it's important at this point because he starts out by talking about teachers. So in the foundation vehicle, a teacher is a respected elder. Then on the Mahayana, the teacher is called a virtuous friend or a friend in virtue. And in Vajrayana, the teacher or the guru or the lama, all three terms work, teacher, lama, guru. But in the Vajrayana, the guru is a Vajra master. And this will help you understand a little bit more about what Kamala Shila is talking about here. To begin this chapter, he talks about that we need to have both calm abiding and insight in order to achieve the ultimate mind of awakening. And this chapter is the causes of insight. We already talked in the previous chapter that we covered last week about calm abiding. So there are three causes of insight. And the first is to rely on an excellent being. The second is hearing a lot. And then the third one is appropriate contemplation. So now let's go back to relying on an excellent being. And here he talks about this excellent being a virtuous friend. So as I said earlier, a virtuous friend is the Mahayana term for a guru or a lama. So he's talking here about Mahayana Dharma practice. Thrangu Rinpoche talks about how we do have our own knowledge. We can, to a certain extent, get along without a virtuous friend, but if we are cultivating insight that this is new territory, foreign territory, and we're not familiar with it, and we have to rely on a virtuous friend if we are going to avoid making mistakes. So we will not be able to meditate properly if we do not have a virtuous friend that can guide us. And of course, that means that the virtuous friend has to have the experience, him or herself, so that they can guide you. There is a term in the West, it's a phrase actually, the blind leading the blind. So if you choose someone to lead you that hasn't had the experiences that they are supposed to guide you to having, then it's like the blind leading the blind. So we want to make sure that our virtuous friend is an excellent one. He mentions in this text, and this might not even be in the text, it quite possibly is something that Thrangu Rinpoche added. And I say that because he mentions Gampopa specifically. So that Gampopa made 3 examples to illustrate how we need a virtuous friend. The first is a traveler. Interesting enough, Thrangu Rinpoche says that, well, nowadays we have maps, signs, and I don't think we had GPS at the time this talk was given, but definitely we have GPS today. When Gampopa was giving this teaching, of course, there were no such things. But it is important today, too, that you can't get an app on your cell phone that you can rely on instead of having a virtuous friend. So for a traveler, you need someone that has traveled on the route that you are taking, that has walked the path. And in the absence of such a person, we will probably make mistakes. And it could be taking the long way rather than the short way. It could be taking the rough way, the tough way, rather than the easy way. And there is the third danger, which is just plain taking a lot of time and energy and not getting anywhere. The next analogy is crossing a large river. So in Tibet, there were very, very few bridges over large rivers. The rivers are surprisingly large in Tibet, the ones that I have seen. And I remember taking a boat ride on one of them from one side to the other. And it was surprisingly, even with an internal combustion engine, a large one, that this boat had a lot of difficulty and required a lot of power to get to the other side. So here is the example that to cross a river, we need a boat and we need a pilot. And if you have a good pilot and a good boat, you can get safely to the other side. So here, the analogy is that with a good, virtuous friend, you will be able to exert yourself in the most beneficial manner, and you will be able to get to the other side. And your efforts will not be wasted. Again, I keep remembering this one crossing. I do not know what river it was in Tibet, but it was a very large river. And you did not just cross straight across. The current was too strong and the distance from one shore to the other was too great. And so the pilot went at an angle, but he was always going upstream, but of course the river is coming downstream, and so you felt like you were standing still. And it took a long time to get to the other side because it was such a wide river. It was quite interesting being on that ferry and traveling that way. But if he would have tried to go straight across, we would have ended up miles downstream when we got to the other shore. So now the third example is consider a dangerous place, a dangerous country, or a dangerous part of the country. The text says we need a heroic friend, that we are going to have fear from wild animals, bandits, and so forth, and that we could lose our possessions to bandits. We could even lose our life. So we need to have this heroic friend who is well armed and who can keep us from experiencing these dangers. The analogy is that our mental afflictions of hatred, desire, and other strong afflictive states of mind, they're like bandits and thieves, and they can deceive us, they can mislead us, and actually bring us into danger and lead us into situations that are going to cause a lot of problems for us. So this is how a virtuous friend will help us, that with a virtuous friend, these afflictions cannot cause us harm, because our virtuous friend will give us instructions on how to work with them and avoid causing ourselves harm and causing other people harm. So there are four characteristics or qualities of this excellent friend in virtue. This being will have relied on other virtuous friends as he or she progressed along the path, and the virtuous friend will have understood the meaning of the Buddha's talks, the sutras, and so forth, and also understood the meaning of the texts that have been written by the followers of the Buddha later on, like this one by Kamalashila. The third is an excellent being has compassion. A virtuous being may be learned, but is not arrogant. And this is a very, very important point, that you want your teacher to take responsibility for teaching the student, you in this case. An excellent being combined with compassion will see what needs to be done to help another and do what is necessary, and understands how to accomplish what they want, and will be patient. So the last, or the fourth characteristic, is that a virtuous friend can endure difficult and disheartening situations. Students of the excellent friend are ordinary beings, and because of that, well, they can become discouraged very simply, that they have delusions and obscurations. Many have In Thrangu Rinpoche's words, the faults of laziness, pride, little respect for the virtuous friend, and are slow to understand. So the virtuous friend will see this and not become angry, not become discouraged, and his or her intention and motivation will not be diminished. So that is what was covered in this first cause, relying on an excellent being. The next is hearing a lot. And this is the second cause of insight. So the student then listens to the words of the Buddha, which would be the sutras, listens to the words of his or her excellent friend, and so forth. Basically, if you listen, you might hear something. If you don't listen, you won't hear anything. So listening is important, and paying attention and actually hearing what you're listening to is even more important. But with that, you apply exertion to this, and then you start being able to understand at a very deep level what is important, what is unimportant. Now, Thrangu Rinpoche does mention mantra and Vajrayana at this point, and he says very simply that secret mantra is not, as some people feel, separate from the teachings that the Buddha gave, that these line up very, very well with the teachings of the Buddha. It's just a different way to practice the teachings of the Buddha. It's also difficult. It requires special students. It's also quick, much more quick than Mahayana. The motivation is the same, on the other hand, which is to be motivated to benefit all beings. Another point about Vajrayana is that the Buddha gave many, many, many teachings to a wide variety of audiences, and he always taught according to the audience. And therefore, it is important to, while you hear a lot of things, to also have a teacher so that you can distinguish what is important for you, where you are at the present time. Hearing many things doesn't mean that you read every book out there that is on Buddhism or even just Tibetan Buddhism. There's a huge amount out there, and so it does require selectivity. He talks about the Lama's advice and quintessential instructions, that these quintessential instructions or pith teachings sum up the teachings of the Buddha very, very precisely, and they have to do what a specific teacher felt summed up these teachings of the Buddha. To quote Thrangu Rinpoche here, says that the virtuous friend has a feeling of much love and tenderness for his student and will say, quote, "Here is something that you must never do. And no matter what, you must do this." So these teachings are very specific to a specific student or a specific group of students. But the Lama does not give these pith instructions in the words of the Buddha, the words that are found in the sutras and so forth. It's very specific and worded for specific students. It does accord with the words of the Buddha. And the origin of these quintessential instructions are the practice of the Lama. So when the student is listening to things, he needs to listen to the words of the Buddha. He needs to listen to the treatises like this one by Kamalashila, and also to the advice of his virtuous friend or her virtuous friend. And then quintessential instructions. So all of this then shows us the path that our predecessors have followed. Listening leads to the results that we are interested in having, and these instructions keep us from making errors and mistakes. Now, the third point is appropriate contemplation. So, in 2 words, contemplate well. Again, this is the third cause for the birth of insight. Blind faith is an obstacle to progress. It's superficial. We have to contemplate well, and blind faith, well, why contemplate? If you're just having blind faith, there's no need to contemplate. But contemplation is essential for us to give birth to insight. So the Buddha instructed his students to examine his teachings in the way a merchant examines gold if he is going to buy it. So there are 3 ways that is mentioned here in the text of examining gold, and this, of course, is from times long gone. But the first is to place the gold in fire, and if the color doesn't change, then it could be gold. If it changes, it's not gold. The next step is to cut the gold and look inside to see if perhaps it's gold on the outside, but who knows, it could be lead on the inside. Gold is heavy, so you need to replace it with a heavy metal. And then you look inside for flaws and so forth. And then the third is that you polish it to see what quality the gold is, how nice a polish it will hold. So we are kind of tasked with doing something similar with the teachings. Examine them for, well, what are the reasons that underlie this particular teaching? Secondly, what benefit would arise from the application of this particular teaching or instruction? And the third one, is this necessary? So these are ways to look at this. What are the reasons that underlie this teaching? What purposes do they serve? What benefit would come through the application of this particular instruction? And is this instruction necessary? And again, this means deep examination over a period of time and contemplation. So we do this until certainty arises. If there is doubt, then that can be a big problem. I remember Khenpo Karthar Rinpoche saying that doubt is a problem if you are practicing the Dharma, and it's a problem if you are engaging in activities in the mundane world. That doubt is a huge problem. So we want to contemplate until certainty arises and we are free of doubt. Without that, if we have doubt, we will be having second thoughts. Maybe I should have, or I've got a choice of whether to go this way or go that way. Maybe I should go this way. Oh, but maybe that way, da, 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 da. And when you're free of doubt, you will make a choice and not have second thoughts about it after you have made the choice. Now, after that, he mentions this. It is now a time to meditate, that you've relied on a virtuous friend, you've heard a lot, and you've contemplated well. So now it's time to meditate. He then talks about various methods for meditation. The first subject that he goes into is about beginning to meditate. That first of all, set aside your other activities and concerns. Don't worry about other things when you are meditating. We just temporarily let go of whatever else is going on in our life. And this can be very difficult in the West because we have so darn much things going on in our lives. But just kind of for a few hours or a few minutes, let go. The second is visit the bathroom. Otherwise, you're going to be wandering back and forth between meditating and thinking about going to the bathroom. And then for motivation, again, start out by wanting to practice so that you can attain the mind of awakening. Then he says to prostrate with faith and devotion to the Buddhas and the Bodhisattvas. Then he talks about doing the prostrations. You have 5 branches. So here is what he mentions. First, hands together, palms facing one another. Then touch the 3 places of our body, top of the head, the throat, and the heart. Top of your head is your body, speech, and then mind is at the heart center. Then he is talking now about a full prostration. So then you get down on your hands and knees and touch your head on the ground. That's point number 4. Number 3 is getting on your hands and knees on the ground. Number 4 is touching your head to the ground at this point. And he think this way, quote, I have abandoned pride and I respect a likeness of the Buddha in front of me. Then you arise, you do that 3 times, 3 of these prostrations, and then you sit down. And he says, then the posture is this: sit down on a comfortable cushion, cross your legs. He says, either in the Vajra posture or loosely. then he says, do not open your eyes in an, quote, exaggerated way. But on the other hand, don't shut them. In this case, he says, look directly ahead. This is a little different than the meditation instructions that Khenpo Karka Rinpoche gives, but if you compare them closely, they're really not that different. But I'm not going to compare them at this point. If you want to discuss them when we come to the questions and answers, I'll gladly do it then. And then he says to make sure that your upper teeth and lower teeth aren't touching, but on the other hand, don't have your mouth gaping. Don't have your mouth wide open when you're meditating either. And then breathe gently, softly, and soundlessly, if that's possible. So then going on here about cultivating calm abiding, that it's important to long for, to want to meditate and to get a certain joy from meditating. This can really help with your practice over the long run. So if you can look at it that way, this will really make it much easier to meditate. That having joy will really make it so much more pleasant when you meditate. The struggle of getting into the shrine room and meditating eventually disappears. Both longing and joy will bring a degree of independence to our minds. Let me read that again properly. Longing and joy will bring a degree of independence to our minds. I think I need new glasses. So then we place our minds on an object. This helps us keep focused and avoid getting distracted. And it can be impure object. It could be a rock, a piece of wood. It could be almost anything. We have five senses, and it could be anything that the senses pick up. And then there is a pure object, and this would be to have a statue of the Buddha, a picture of a statue of the Buddha, this sort of thing. Also, it could be a visualization of the Buddha. But anyway, meditate on or rest your awareness on that pure object. By meditating this way, we rest our mind in equipoise. We do need to check for faults from time to time, and also to see if our meditation is stabilized during the meditation. If your meditation has stabilized, then continue meditating. And if it hasn't stabilized, then you start looking for faults. First one is laxity, lethargy, too loose. That as a result of this fault, our minds become unclear. He uses the word thick. We become sleepy, drowsy, and so forth. And so we need to recognize this fault. It can be a huge problem. He compares it this way, that laxity is like blindness. And it's like our eyes have gone blind, that we can't see. It's like dwelling in darkness. We become like surrounded by darkness. And third, that it is like having our eyes closed. So the remedy is to take joy in the light, meditate on the body of the Buddha as radiating light, or just plain a bright, it could be a bright light. Imagine a bright light coming from the ceiling of the room you're in. That is not in the text, but this is an instruction Khenpo Karthar Rinpoche gave. Just imagine that there is a bright light coming from the ceiling and you're just filling you up with this bright light. So the opposite problem is excitement. Too many thoughts, too much sensory input. Also, you're judging things on this is good, that is bad, and on and on and on. So we get into this, I like the term train of thoughts. It's like a train that is endless in length, and one car after another is going by, and you're in your car wanting to get back on the road, but the cars are there and you can't go forward. So you just have this endless train of thoughts. Then there are memories of past experiences and so forth. Speculation on the future. You might feel like you need to start writing poetry or whatever. So the remedy here is to meditate on impermanence. Meditate means contemplate here, look at, examine the futility of cyclic existence. Meditate on the suffering, your suffering, the suffering of others, the three types of suffering, the suffering of change, and all pervasive suffering. So this will help us realize that thinking about all of these other things that keep popping into our mind are really pointless. They're distracting us and they're keeping us from what we really need to be doing, what is important. So as we cultivate calm, abiding, we become accustomed to it. And then from that, a sense of well-being arises in our bodies. Our minds remain at ease and calm when we're meditating, and that our mind becomes independent. So that finishes this chapter. I am now going to talk about Chapter 4, the selflessness of persons. So this is the way to cultivate insight. Insight will add knowledge to our understanding of ultimate truth, and that we investigate and analyze with reasoning. And as a result of that, doing it over and over again, we come to a conceptual understanding of our abiding nature. And gradually through that, then we arrive at direct perception. This is the difference between prajna and jhana. Prajna, we accumulate knowledge that we accumulate. Jhana is primordial wisdom, which has always been there, and you uncover it. So this is how insight works. when this yeshe or jhana dawns, ignorance and obscurations are gone. Here the example is when the sun shines, darkness is gone. They can't exist together. So calm abiding stabilizes our mind, doesn't generate wisdom. The insight gives birth to wisdom. And wisdom gets to the roots of our obscuration. It doesn't, you might say, weaken our obscurations. It actually totally uproots them. And this is using the example of, let's say, gardening or farming, where you can cut weeds, but then they'll grow back. But if you get them out by the roots, they're gone. They won't grow again. So we cultivate wisdom or insight by methods in the sutra and then also methods in secret mantra. In the sutras, we have analytical meditation. We investigate, analyze, we have inferences. We infer this and infer that. So we investigate, we analyze, and as a result, certainty develops. And that certainty is very important. It gives, you might say, stability. It gives us knowledge that we can base our insight meditation on. Now, secret mantra is different. In secret mantra, we rest in equipoise that we've attained through meditation, and we look directly at the mind's abiding nature. Now, Kamalashila only talks about sutra meditation, so we're not going to talk about Vajrayana meditation here. So there are two stages of sutra analytical meditation: the selflessness of the person and the selflessness of phenomena. This is a very important point. Now, in this chapter, we're talking about the selflessness of the person. And the interesting thing is that, of course, we have made this mistake. All of us have made this mistake lifetime after lifetime after lifetime, thinking that we have a self that is permanent, real, unchanging, unique, solid. And it's very difficult for us to see this differently. But if we are going to abandon mental afflictions, we have to abandon this conception of a self. This is the source of all of our afflictive states of mind. We need to abandon desire, hatred, bewilderment, pride, and envy. That these are all serious problems, huge problems. And unless we remove this conception of a self, they cannot be uprooted and removed. He goes on to the conception of a self has two aspects: the conception of something as a self and thinking of something belonging to the self. The first is thinking I, The second is mine. When we think of this is mine, he uses the example of a watch. It's interesting. If you are in the presence of somebody else dropping a watch on the floor and it breaking, it just doesn't seem to be too much of a problem. It's just a watch. But if it's your watch, it's a problem. And this is where the problem is, that we have so much that is mine, which doesn't actually exist when you examine it, that we have all kinds of problems about mine being lost, threatened, destroyed, altered. All kinds of things could happen to whatever we consider is mine. So when there's a threat, we respond with hatred and anger, and suffering grows. And also, there is the desire that arises with, I need one of these. Maybe I need two or three of these, and so forth. So he goes into a number of questions here that I'm going to go through here. Is mine one entity with the watch? Is mine present as an entity different from that of the watch? Is mine present inside of the watch? Is mine present outside of the watch? And of course, his conclusion is it's not anywhere inside the watch, outside the watch, somewhere in between, inside and outside. We just think the watch is mine. And then, of course, there is this abstract mine, M-I-N-E. And where is that? So I have to tell this story, which I think all of you heard before, about the bag of trash. But maybe someone will watch this on the internet and have never heard this before when I post this on my YouTube channel. So a friend of mine has a business in a small little town in rural northwest Wisconsin. And while he has a car and a motorcycle, he also likes the nature, and he sometimes will ride a bicycle to and from work in the summertime. And he told me one day he was riding home after work, and there in the middle of this country road was a bag of trash. And he got very angry at people not caring about the environment, not caring about other people, and just throwing bags of trash out the window as they drive along these lightly traveled roads. And when he got up to it close and saw the contents of the bag, he realized it was a bag of fresh groceries. And now his anger vanished instantly, because now it was his bag of groceries. It was mine, so to speak. And he was happy that it was my bag of groceries. But when he got on his bicycle with it, it was too bulky and heavy for him to ride the bicycle and carry at the same time. So now he was worried. He was paranoid that if he left it, somebody else would find it and take it, perhaps the original owner of the bag of groceries. So he hid it in the brush on the side of the road, and then got on his bicycle and rode home quickly, of course, worrying about the bag disappearing before he got back there with the car. gets to the house, gets in the car, goes back, stops, goes into the brush, and there is his bag of groceries, and he's happy. Gets in the car with the bag and drives home. Well, that bag has done nothing. It has just laid there the whole time. Everything that went through his mind was his own mind, his own projection, and so forth. And that is what is being discussed here, is how we project mind on things, and then our afflictive states of mind just go wild, and there's no freedom. So to continue here with the Thrangu Rinpoche's commentary on this, we think that my body exists and my mind exists, and therefore I exist. And it seems that way, and of course you can get probably just about everybody that you know to agree with you, unless you know some Buddhists. This is the way we commonly think. There even is a very famous saying by a Western philosopher, "I think, therefore I am." I won't go into that at this point. I'm just putting that out there. So if we look at our 5 aggregates, and an aggregate is a collection of things. So there is the aggregate of form, our physical body, feeling, discrimination, mental events or compositional factors, and consciousness. And if we look at these, they're just a collection of things. And the idea that there is a solid form that is unchanging and so forth is a fiction. It's a fabrication. And there really isn't anything there. You can look at a solid form, but then realize its parts. Hand as fingers and a thumb, and they have joints, and they're flesh and bone and sinew and blood and other things. And then you look at them through a microscope, and you'll find that they're made out of smaller things. And the more you reduce it, the less is there. And eventually you get to, there's nothing there. So anyway, he says the remedy for this fixation on our form is, as I just said, our bodies can be reduced into smaller and smaller and smaller parts. The parts aren't the body. Our bodies age and change. If we were our body, well, obviously we are not permanent. We change, and then of course bodies die. So there's not a self there. And then feeling, well, sometimes we have feelings of pleasure, sometimes pain, sometimes neutral feelings, and sometimes we're really not having much feeling at all. Feelings can change hour to hour. In the example of the bag of trash, the feelings could change in the blink of an eye. So there's nothing solid and permanent there. And discrimination, it's the same way. Compositional factors, that these change. Then there's consciousness, and he goes into the 6 consciousnesses, so I'm going to list them here. These are part of this aggregate of consciousness. Again, these are collections. There's the eye consciousness, the ear consciousness, nose consciousness, tongue consciousness, body consciousness, and mental consciousness. And all of them come and go. There's nothing permanent there. They're not solid, so to speak. So we can't find a self there. And if we look at our mind over one lifetime, we'll find that it changes constantly. Again, as in the bag of trash. One of my favorite ways for explaining this is all the different types of psychology that the West has developed: early childhood, childhood psychology, teenage psychology, adult psychology, midlife crisis psychology, geriatrics, and hospice, and there are probably 20 others in between. Obviously, as we go through these stages of life, we are different. We look at things differently, and there's nothing solid and permanent as we go through life with all these changes. And of course, I think we all probably know people, and maybe even tried this, to not change hairstyles that were popular 30 years ago when we were young, and so forth. And so here is something that came from Canadian television, from the Red Green Show, and it was the man's prayer. And it is, I'm a man, I can change if I have to, I guess. You still change, even if you have that attitude. So the more we know about this, the more we can see the self as being a creation that has no reality behind it. We become accustomed to this in our meditation and our contemplation. We begin to understand this non-existence of a self, and as a result, the mental afflictions that are rooted in this conception of a self naturally subside and eventually cease. He talks about the continuity of the aggregates of consciousness going from one moment to another to another. Well, that does not mean that there is this permanent self. It just means that things are interconnected. There's a flow there. And he uses the example of a great river. He says that it comes down from melted snow in the mountains, and then it ends up in the ocean. And in the meanwhile, as it grows in volume, more water joins it from lower elevations, and that it's still just drops of water rather than a big, huge river. And this is the way our aggregates work too. Again, I have to put a disclaimer on here, but I minored in philosophy when I was doing my undergraduate work. And what came to mind when he was talking about this was Heraclitus, a Greek philosopher, and one of his main teachings was on impermanence. And he is the one that said you cannot step into the same river twice. And the reason you can't step into the same river twice is the river is continually changing. If you're standing on the shore and you're looking at the river, in a second later, the river that was there flowed downstream, and you're looking at a different river, different water. And if you step into the river, you're changed because now you have stepped into the river. And if you step back into the river, you are now a person that has already stepped into the river. So the person has changed, the river has changed. It's a different way of looking things, but it's basically coming to the same thing. And There's not this solid self. There's not this solid river. It's constantly changing. It's made out of parts and so forth. I'm going to conclude this chapter tonight. Work this way, analyzing the selflessness of the person with reasoning, which I've gone through, then having reached this understanding, meditate on it. When you realize it, then this idea of the aggregates being a self will automatically be abandoned. You're not going to cling to it. When that has been abandoned, our mental afflictions are gone. We have then realized the purpose of realizing the non-existence. We will have understood that this is just a conception of a self and nothing more. The last analogy is Chandakirti uses the example of a chariot. It's made up of many, many different parts. The parts are individual parts. They fit in certain places and have certain functions, but none of them are a chariot. And you can divide the parts into smaller parts and smaller parts and smaller parts. So you can look at a chariot and call it a chariot, and it functions like a chariot. It's really not a chariot. It's just made up of parts and pieces. So this is how you look at and reason about the selflessness of people.